Hi, everybody, and welcome to episode 46 of the Pet Behavior Chat. And I've got Ilse with me here today because we want to talk about something super important, and that is muzzles and muzzle training. So I guess I'm just going to set the scene a little bit for us in terms of what we want to chat through. But in terms of coming from a fear-free approach, and also in terms of, I guess, what Ilse and I have both noticed a lot during our work with our behavior patients, is that muzzles should really be just part of pretty much every dog's life. And I guess we'll chat through why we feel that way and how we can make that happen, and how we can, sort of set the dogs up for success from a really young age. So I think that's where we're going to go with this conversation. So hi, Ilse, welcome.
Hello, nice to be back.
Exactly. Always great to chat with you. And would you agree that this is a topic that we're both pretty passionate about?
Absolutely. I think it is so important to really think about, as you were saying, think about muzzles as just part of our equipment toolkit, and almost reframing it as it's not something that is aversive. It's not something that signals that your dog is dangerous. Although there's been a shift in the industry in terms of thinking about muzzles differently, I think it's more kind of the professionals that's working, that shift has happened. But I do think there are still education around that needed with, kind of the general public.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I think there can be a really sort of negative emotional response to thinking about muzzles. I think maybe historically that comes from the fact that, we're used to seeing dogs wearing muzzles, or the dogs that we're used to seeing wearing muzzles are usually, working dogs, large breed dogs that we would perhaps think more about as having, aggressive behaviors or showing aggressive behaviors. And I think that can be really difficult to then bring that back to our own pet, who's our family dog, who lives with us and our family and our kids. Thinking about putting a muzzle on them, our pet dogs. But I think you're right. That's exactly where the education piece needs to come in that we don't want to, think about muzzles being used just for instances where we absolutely have to, i.e. in aggressive events, but that we actually use them as a preemptive tool, as a precautionary tool, as something that actually sets us and our dogs up for success. I think that's really important too.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I just want to say we've got some amazing freebies to give away at the end of this podcast. So we're going to give you a link to Ilse's amazing free muzzle fitting video. So stick around for that. Well, the link's going to be in the show notes, and we'll let you know how you can get access to that a little bit later on. But Ilse, why don't you chat us through a little bit the idea of having the muzzle just as part of our toolkit? What do you mean by that, and how do you think we should sort of start incorporating that into our dogs' lives?
So if we think about the equipment that we use to essentially with safety, so if we think about a leash, we think about a harness, essentially that is actually also a safety tool. It is going on a walk, making sure that our dog is safe, not running away, close to us. And the same goes for a muzzle. So as we, a lot of the focus when it comes to especially puppy life skills and puppy training is getting the puppy used to a harness, getting the puppy used to being on a leash, and the same needs to go for muzzles. So in terms of our puppy life skills that we do, muzzle training forms part of that. From a very young age, it is just part of that toolkit, because we really never know when it is going to be necessary. So in that really necessary situation, so for example, coming to the vet, or especially even if the dog doesn't display high fear, anxiety, and stress kind of for your standard vaccinations or health check, if there is an emergency and the dog is really, really in a lot of pain, we do know that even a dog that has never displayed any defensive, aggressive behaviors, when pain and severe pain is involved, that is an actual risk. And not just a risk for the clinical team, also a risk for the dog's fear, anxiety, and stress. So if we find ourselves, or the dog finds themselves in that situation, and we see that FAS is escalating, but we've triaged it in such a way that it has to, it's a life-saving situation, and the dog lashes out and baring teeth and giving all those signals, we know it is going to potentially escalate into a bite. And if we are then in a situation where we need to force a muzzle on, that is actually going to escalate that fear, anxiety, and stress. So we need that layer of safety. However, if there's any aversive history, so if the muzzle, for example, was forced on before, or this is the first time that the dog needs the muzzle on and we force it onto the dog, we essentially are causing almost trauma around the muzzle. So if from a young age, so from puppy through adolescence, through adulthood, if we really use the muzzle as we would a harness or a leash, it just makes it so much easier for everyone, easier for the dog to cope. And I think a lot of times people see that fear, anxiety, and stress, especially if it's a situation where it's, for example, in the veterinary clinic or going on a walk and there's lots of kids around or lots of other dogs around. And if a dog has that history and it's something that they cannot cope with, of course, we do need that layer of safety. So a lot of times, unfortunately, people go, okay, now I need to do muzzle training. Now it's, I need to cram it in, and it becomes this kind of stressful event. And we have a lot of success in terms of, kind of pre-vaccinations or procedures to train the muzzle and make sure that the muzzle elicits a positive emotional state. However, then after that event, the muzzle goes back into the cupboard. And then we run the risk of, again, the muzzle comes out and, okay, it's vet time. Or I'm going to have to go out somewhere where I'm not necessarily comfortable. And then we ruin all of that training that we worked so hard on. So it really is a case of once your dog is really familiar with it and we trained it correctly, when you do your training, if you have the correct muzzle, it's very easy to deliver treats directly into their mouth. Or, if you go on a walk, every now and then just bringing the muzzle out, so that we keep up with that and really reinforce that positive emotional state, so that the dog has the same reaction that they would when the harness comes out, the leash comes out, fun times. Oh my goodness, we're going to do a little bit of training now. We're going to do some lovely walking. And so I think that is really vital to bear in mind.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. And that's such a great example about the emergency situation at the veterinary clinic, because I think that's what we're trying to convey. If your dog is muzzle trained, chances are you might never need the muzzle, but just imagine if you do. Imagine they, God forbid, get hit by a car, or, something bad happens and you need to bring them to the veterinary clinic in an emergency. And then, the dog is very painful and fearful, and then we need maybe a muzzle, and that's probably going to be the worst situation in which to then try and put the muzzle on. And actually reminds me of my sister's dog. I was just thinking about him as you were talking there. So something very similar happened to him, actually. He broke his leg, obviously unexpectedly, and he wasn't used to a muzzle, and handling him was quite difficult because he was so sore, he was so painful, and it would have just made life so much easier if he had been familiar with wearing a muzzle. So these are situations that we always think, oh, it's never going to happen, but if it does happen, that's something I think is going to be so useful for you, for the dog, for the veterinary team, for everybody, and is just going to make that whole experience so much less traumatic than it already is. And yeah, I agree. There are so many other kind of social contexts, social situations. And one of the things I was actually thinking about is the bully breed ban that came about in the UK, just recently. And all of a sudden we have, a whole breed group or phenotype group of dogs that all of a sudden need to wear a muzzle, in a very sort of short period of time. And, now we've got sort of a gun to our chest in terms of, we're under time pressure and we need to muzzle train them. And wouldn't it have been nice to have had those dogs, comfortable with a muzzle from when they were babies? So, yeah, there are so many massive pros for thinking about muzzle training early. And I really love that, the whole aspect of, just as we're harness training or leash training, loose leash walking, incorporate the muzzle into that and make it a really positive association. I think that's so important. So one of the prerequisites, though, of a dog having actually a positive experience and a positive association with the muzzle is, as you mentioned, actually getting a muzzle that fits correctly and the correct type of muzzle. So why don't you chat us through like what actually is the right type of muzzle? Because there are so many different types out there. And, how important is it that we get the right muzzle and the right fit of the muzzle?
So that is really key. So there are some muzzles that are really just physically uncomfortable or restrictive and can, cause pain. So the best muzzles to use is the basket type muzzles. So that is the muzzle that almost looks like a little, for lack of a better analogy, almost like a little cage around the dog's snout. What's very important is that for a correct fit, it doesn't push into their eyes, because if it pushes into their eyes, it can affect breathing because it's pushing onto, their kind of, nasal airway and their nose. Also, in terms of their eyes, we know it's sensitive. It can block vision, which can potentially, it's just not comfortable from that standpoint. And then very, very importantly is dogs need to pant. Dogs need to breathe comfortably. And with the basket muzzle, it really is, if the fit is, a couple of centimeters, and I'm talking like a good, also depending on the breed of the dog, and that's why it's so important. I know a lot of the muzzle manufacturers would kind of have these guidelines, but a lot of times it's, it doesn't actually fit the structure. Some dogs, we really want to be able to make sure that full pant, because if we are going to use the muzzle on a walk, and it is, for example, here a little bit warmer, a little bit more humid, that pant is really important to help them obviously breathe, regulate their temperature, all of those things. So it is really important that it does actually sit quite a substantial amount below the jaw when their jaw's actually closed. Another important thing is that we can deliver treats, so that it's comfortable enough that there is a little bit of a gap where we can place our fingers through, and that they can take the snack, or they can lick easily if we're using peanut butter or cream cheese or the kind of cat puree. And then also the fit on around the head. So we want to make sure that it goes behind the ears and it sits quite comfortably, so not too high up. Also, obviously not too low down. But if it's too high up or too low down, and ideally, if we do it correctly, the dog would never paw at the muzzle, because pawing at the muzzle immediately says to us it's uncomfortable. So that's also quite a telling thing. So if you do have a muzzle and you've done the training and the dog starts pawing, not the right fit. And of course, drinking. So we need to make sure that they are able to actually drink from the muzzle. So if they've got a large enough bowl, that they can actually very easily lap up waters. So not restrictive, really comfortable. And if we really think about it, because of that individual structure that every dog has. Sure, you know, we've got breed standards and all of those things, but ideally, and it's not always possible, is to have a custom-made muzzle, generally speaking. I mean, that is like the gold standard ideal, but I do know it is quite tricky to have that. So yeah, I think that is definitely the most important thing is comfort, being able to do all the physiological things that is normal for a dog to do.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And just to kind of hone down a little bit on that, so what we absolutely don't want to use are these kind of nylon or mesh type muzzles that we can frequently see for sale. So they're usually very, very tight around the dog's snout, around their nose. They've got absolutely no give in them whatsoever. The dog cannot flex their jaw at all. They can't kind of open their mouths. They can't pant, they can't eat, they can't drink. Those are probably the worst in my mind. Those, they're usually black and they're usually out of nylon or mesh, and they're just not appropriate really for anything. And I agree, the basket type muzzles, and they come in so many shapes and sizes now. And I think it depends a little bit on the dog that you have. So you were just mentioning about, you know, fit and custom made. So I think there are probably, you know, many dogs who would be able to wear, you know, a standard muzzle, if you like. Then we just have to get the right size. However, I think if you have a dog that perhaps is a brachycephalic, that maybe is sort of a bully type breed, or that has just a different sort of head shape, and, you know, with all the different sort of breed crosses that we see these days, that's very possible. I think that is then the moment where you might want to look for getting something custom made. Also, if you have a dog that has a particularly large head, for example. So there are so many, I think, different moments that it might be appropriate to look for something custom made. But I think there are also a lot of head shapes and nose shapes and sizes that, you know, would be able to cope very well with a sort of a standard pre-manufactured sized type muzzle. But yeah, I completely agree. It's so absolutely crucial that they have to be able to perform their species specific behaviors. So and, you know, even being able to sniff is really important as well.
Yeah, I think a lot of the, you know, manufacturers that do bulk, they generally focus on, you know, we do know that, I guess, you know, the kind of mesocephalic, the you know, standard skull shape is kind of the most, it just probably makes sense from a manufacturing standpoint. But also, so as you mentioned, the brachycephalic, the kind of stub nose, so like your French bulldogs, your English bulldogs, pugs, those guys, you know, I haven't, unless it's custom made, personally, from my experience, I haven't seen a kind of manufactured muzzle that really fits nicely. And then, of course, here in the UAE, for example, we've got a lot of our sighthound types, our Salukis. We have a lot of Saluki crosses, greyhounds. I mean, and of course, with them, you know, there's really long nose. You know, you can kind of imagine that Borzoi. You know, they definitely would need something a little bit more custom. Well, they would need something custom made. So it's just, you know, bearing that in mind and just really seeing. And one of the things, sorry, that I didn't mention with the fit is also that the fit in the front, we also wanted to actually go a little bit over the nose. So a lot of times people kind of think the muzzle, even with the basket muzzle, it needs to sit quite close to the nose, where that is not the case. So again, just fitting comfortably on the bridge of the nose and giving them a little bit of that space. It just makes it easier. Again, it's more comfortable. So that's also something to bear in mind when we get the right fit.
Absolutely. And of course, the other wonderful thing about getting a custom-made muzzle is that many manufacturers make muzzles in all different colors, pink and blue and orange and yellow. So again, that's moving us away from this idea that we have these kind of black, or dark leather, heavy type muzzles that kind of give this sort of menacing image, I guess, of the dog that's wearing them. So I think a lot has been done recently in the last few years about having much more choice, in terms of muzzles, rainbow colors and all kinds of things, which are, much nicer, I think, for everybody involved, and just start to change that perception of what a muzzle actually means. It doesn't mean beware, this dog is dangerous. It just means, hey, we'd like some space, please, and we're wearing this for safety reasons, and for preemptive reasons rather than reactive reasons. So that's another really good reason to get a custom-made muzzle, is because you can choose the color, which is really lovely. And so on that note, the muzzle fitting note, Ilse, you've made an amazing video, which is about, what is it, 10 minutes long, I think?
Yeah, it's roughly about 10 minutes long, and really going through, without actually having the muzzle, really going through how you can physically measure with either a piece of string or a seamstress measuring tape, to measure it, so that you can then take that and actually measure the muzzle before you purchase it.
Yeah, and that video is absolutely free of charge, and we are going to put the link to that free of charge video in the show notes, so that anybody who is considering getting a muzzle for their dog, or maybe somebody who has a new puppy, and I guess the proviso with puppies is that potentially as they grow you might need a different muzzle as they get bigger and as the shape of their face changes. So for puppies, as with anything, as with a harness, the muzzle might be something you might need to get a couple of versions of as they grow older. But yeah, for anybody who is looking to get a muzzle for their dog, have a look at our free video, and that will give you a really good idea as to what you need to consider when you're actually thinking of the fit of the muzzle. So that's a super cool resource for everybody. All right, let's move on to the actual practical training piece. Now, obviously, we haven't got time to go into all of the fine details when we're thinking about muzzle training, but in terms of just giving us a bit of an overview on kind of the methodology, I guess, that we would be using for muzzle training, give us a bit of an overview, like a big picture of what that might look like.
Yeah, absolutely. So the first step, as with most things. So again, think about any equipment, whether it's a harness, whether it's actually a crate as well, is step one is to really have a really strong, positive emotional state when it comes to the muzzle. So muzzle equals amazing things, high value. The actual sight of the muzzle won't elicit any negative emotional response. We really want that high, oh, I'm so happy to have the muzzle around. So that is vital. And I just want to, kind of reiterate that with anything that we do, a lot of times it might seem almost like you're not progressing because, muzzle, all the snacks, muzzle, all the snacks, the muzzle predicts that. And that is so important that, that takes up, a good quarter of the actual training. So a lot of times we can kind of feel frustrated, like, oh, but I just want to get the head in the muzzle, and it's really not about that. We know with anything, the if that foundation is super, super solid, it's going to make it so much easier. It's going to make it faster. The learning's going to happen. And then, kind of building on from there would be a very important thing with the muzzle is that your dog dresses themselves, i.e. they put their head in the muzzle willingly. And we can then, from there, it could either be, using clicker or marker training where we approximate them inside. And then very, very importantly is, so dog's nose goes in, they wear it. And what's very important is we take it off. So we don't want them to put nose in and then back out, put nose in and then back out. We almost want to move it away from them before they back out. Obviously not, because when we get to a stage where it's clipped on and they almost have, we can inadvertently almost train a behavioral loop, i.e. my nose goes in, my nose comes out, snap, or, it almost becomes part of and we don't want that, because we know if nose goes in and I want to, move out and now it's on my head, panic, because it's not doing what I've been taught and predicted from the dog's point of view. So that's very, very important. And then building on from that, to start adding a little bit of duration, and then actually starting to feed or reward in position, i.e. then through the muzzle. And again, almost like as you're feeding, moving it off without getting, I always tend to get a little bit too technical, and I want to break down the steps. But again, we know with teaching, we need to really break down the steps. So, you want to split. So we call it splitting. So almost like every single behavior that needs to happen, i.e. orientating to the muzzle, putting my nose in the muzzle, keeping my nose in the muzzle, needs to be broken down before the next step can happen. I think we kind of lump things together. We almost lump. I want to get all of those behaviors, and actually every single muscle movement is a behavior. And then from there, we need to bear in mind, so at the moment, I'm working with a couple of our behavior patients on specifically muzzle training. And although the foundations are the same, again, you need to tweak it. Every dog is different. Every dog responds differently. If I just I can think of 3 dogs at the top, top of my head, and they're all slightly different in terms of whether it's reward delivery, whether it's, of course, the pace of learning, always varies. But then from there, I almost see it as when the actual clip, so whether it's a clip, whether it's a strap that comes on, is teaching that separately. So making sure that the dog is actually comfortable with the sound of it, the actual position of it, without having to worry about the muzzle physically being on their face. Although I've seen with some of our patients that they're actually quite okay because of that really strong reinforcement. Yeah. That they're quite happy to keep their nose in the muzzle when the clip happens, and then from there, duration while the muzzle is on, positive experiences while the muzzle is on. You almost want them to learn that as they're moving, it's as if they're moving into the muzzle. So again, that is kind of reward delivery, and then tying it or adding it onto wearing the harness with the muzzle, because again, we changed the antecedent because now I've got my harness on. I didn't have my harness on before, and actually starting to build that in from the start as well. So within different contexts, and then once they're super, super happy to have the muzzle on for an extended period of time, of course, still reinforcing in between, then starting to proof it, taking it in the garden, taking it in different areas, having it on in the car, and then just making that learning, I call it the learning bubble, making that bubble a little bit bigger so that it generalizes to all sorts of different scenarios. So that's kind of the broad
big picture.
Yeah, overview.
Yeah. So I think it's really important to just note that what you described first, so that creating that positive emotional response to the muzzle being around, actually has a learning theory basis to it. So that's what we call classical conditioning. So think of Pavlov's dog. I think, everybody can kind of understand what we're talking about when we say that. So it's almost like muzzle comes out equals a positive predictor. So the presence of the muzzle will alone will help the dog feel positive and in a good emotional state. So that's the classical conditioning piece. And then the second piece, which is the actual putting the nose in the muzzle, starting to wear it. That's a more operant conditioning piece. And obviously, we always want to use positive reinforcement. We don't use any of the other quadrants at all, certainly from a muzzle training perspective. So everything that Ilse has just mentioned has very strong scientific background, has very strong learning theory roots, and is, proven to be kind of the best way of training this. So that's the one thing. And I think the other thing I just wanted to quickly touch on, so you just mentioned that we often use muzzle training as part of our treatment plan for our behavior patients. And, you work with them alongside myself, and you said, you could just off the top of your head think of 3 dogs that you are currently working with. And I think it's a really important piece to sort of stress that sometimes when we're using the muzzle as part of a behavior treatment plan because the dog has some behavioral presentations, the journey to training might be slightly slower depending on their brain health and where they're at. If they're extremely anxious or if they're aggressive because they're fearful, training the muzzle might take longer. And I think in those situations, it would be really, really important to work with a professional that can help guide you through that journey, because it might be that, you absolutely have to just take things a lot slower, and that splitting is into even smaller pieces. And that might get a little bit frustrating if you're trying to work through that on your own. So having somebody like Ilse there to kind of work you through that is a really, really good thing to have. And we absolutely include muzzle training in many, many of our treatment plans. We do see, dogs where we perhaps have had aggression to family members, whether that be children or the adults in the home. And having safety management pieces, the muzzle being one of them, there are many other safety management pieces, but oftentimes it's that actually allows the dog to remain in the home, right? Because we have safety pieces in place that help to protect against injury from aggressive events. And we know that in many of our cases, clients are at the end of the road. Oftentimes, unfortunately, they seek us out in the last instance, which, we always wish they would come to us slightly sooner. But it sometimes can be the difference between life or death, or staying in the home or not staying in the home for that animal. So muzzle training, as we've spoken about this whole episode, has so many uses, but I think it's really important not to underestimate that they can be a life-saving tool for a dog if they are able to wear a muzzle comfortably. And it might be that, they wear the muzzle in situations that are really tricky for them, such as visitors coming to the home, or let's say the child has a play date and there are lots of children in the home and it starts to become difficult to kind of supervise that. And then we talk about multiple layers of safety, and the muzzle can be one of those. So again, just a plug and a shout out for how incredibly important and valuable muzzles can be if they're implemented correctly, and if the dog is trained to wear them correctly. And that whole piece that Ilse, you mentioned at the beginning, of incorporating that into your puppy's, every sort of everyday life and training, how important that piece is just really, really valuable. And so on that note, aside from our free muzzle fitting video, we also have a muzzle training course, which is a 3-video course also delivered by Ilse, which is absolutely brilliant in my mind, because Ilse kind of talks you through step by step all the different stages that she's just spoken about, but also it gives you some troubleshooting pieces as well. So what happens if this piece of the training perhaps isn't working how you maybe think it should? So what are the steps to go back? Where are the troubleshooting pieces? So do you want to just quickly talk through, Ilse, the 3 different videos that we have in our muzzle training course?
Yes. So I discuss muzzle fitting, how to I actually go through the different kinds of muzzles. I show the kind of muzzles that is not ideal, the ones that we want to stay away from, and then the ones that we would use. And really the first video or lesson is really about that foundation and getting that foundation through. And the way that we structured the course is really getting the first lesson 100% down. And I make it very, very clear that don't even look at lesson 2 and 3 until you've, kind of ticked all the boxes, so to speak, of lesson 1. And that's really about the foundation. I go through various steps that, for example, if you have a dog that has had a very negative or traumatic experience with a muzzle, how, we can start incorporating it, because again, it's about how they feel about it. So if you have a dog that's already, they see the muzzle and they're like, whoa, 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 how to very gradually introduce it, different steps in terms of how to, I show with my dogs various ways that you can do it. So having a look at, because my boys are very different in terms of personality and outlook on life. So showing examples of some of the different ways that you can tweak it. And then, so they really build on each other. So the first one is really that foundational, getting all of those things in place. There's summaries at the end of the lessons to, so visual, like actually, written out summaries, so you can kind of double check that all of those things are in place. And then the second and third lesson really builds on that. So the second lesson is then how do we start with, actually now building on duration, getting them to move in the muzzle, different kind of games that we can play with the muzzle. I'm a big fan of games, and if the learning isn't fun, we know that also scientifically, if learning is fun, it goes into it's easier, it goes into long-term memory faster. So so then building on that, starting to introduce slightly different, our body is obviously also important. So if we, for example, started teaching it while sitting down, all of a sudden we're standing, again, we're changing the antecedent of what that looks like and teaching them that, hey, man, the game's the same. Game's the same whether, regardless of our position as well. And then lesson 3 is then building on lesson 2. So it really is that progression through all of the steps, and then actually having it, how to start taking it on the road, things to look out for. I go quite a bit into the mechanics of muzzle training, because of course the mechanics are physically how you kind of handle the muzzle, how you can deliver the various ways of delivering the reward. So yeah, I think it's quite a thorough step going through. And as you've mentioned, there is troubleshooting, there is ways to kind of rethink things and tweak things. So I really thought about all the things also based on experience and what are patients, some of the stumbling blocks, or essentially the troubleshooting based on all these various dogs that I've had the pleasure and really I'm grateful for working with such an array of different dogs. Every single dog teaches you something new.
Definitely.
And taking all of that knowledge and conveying it as simply as possible in the course.
Yeah, no, it's an amazing course. I absolutely love it. And then also, if you do take the course and if you do run into some stumbling blocks that you can't figure out by yourself, you can absolutely then do a personalized one-on-one coaching session with Ilse. And that doesn't have to be in person. We do a lot of these virtually. So we have clients all around the world. Ilse has literally muzzle trained and crate trained many dogs prior to relocation in all countries in the world. So that's an option that you have as well. So if you do start down the course, and if you find that your dog has a specific behavior that you get stuck on, or a specific step in the process that you get stuck on, then you can absolutely come in and do some one-on-one individualized training with Ilse. So we've got all the bases covered. We've got your free muzzle fitting video. We've got the 3-part muzzle training course. And then we also have one-on-one individualized packages for you. Before we sign off, I want to say one really important thing, and that is we're talking about muzzles for dogs. I personally do not condone the use of muzzles for cats in any situation. And I say that because I actually, not that long ago, last year, when I was in a practice in another area in the world, saw technicians still using muzzles on cats in the veterinary setting. And that's just not an appropriate way of dealing with cats in the veterinary setting. So everything that we've spoken about today is very much specifically geared towards dogs and muzzles. Cat muzzles, in my personal opinion, in my mind, and I'm just stating my personal opinion here, cat muzzles have no place anywhere, ever. We have so much better ways of handling cats in the veterinary clinic that don't cause fear, anxiety, and stress that muzzles do. So I just want to make that really, really clear at the end of this podcast that in my personal opinion, I don't condone the use of muzzles on cats at all. Yeah, so just a little thought to leave us with there. However, yeah, go ahead.
No, when you told me about it, I haven't even, for me, it's like unfathomable. I'm literally, I can't even imagine what that would look like, what that would feel like for the cat. It is just such a, for me, it's just such a alien idea.
Yeah. Well, and what it looks like is literally a whole face type of coverage, if you like. It's because the way a cat's head is shaped, you can't get a muzzle just onto their nose. So it's essentially a structure that covers their entire face, also visually blocking them and essentially completely inhibiting them. And it's pretty traumatic for the cats. If you've ever seen a cat wearing one of those devices, yeah, it's not great in my opinion. So yeah, I just wanted to make that clear. However, for dogs, as long as it's done correctly, and as long as, we think about it, I guess, in the way that we've been talking about it today, I think it's an invaluable piece of equipment. Alrighty, I really hope you guys enjoyed this episode. I hope there were some valuable pieces in there. Thank you, Ilse, for joining me today and for sharing your amazing and invaluable insights on muzzle training. I know you're the muzzle training queen, so really happy to have you here today. And yeah, for everyone else, check out the links that we're going to put in the show notes for our free fitting video and for our muzzle training course as well. And I'm really looking forward to seeing everybody again next week for episode 47. Until then, bye for now.